I don't know if I if I say it right or not. He's a regional manager for HHS Marine Service at SGS, Singapore. He has 19 years of experience working with environmental sciences in the public and private sectors. He holds a master's degree with a major in coastal resource management from France and a PhD in life science from Denmark. In 2011, he received a Young Elite Scientist Award from the Danish Ministry of Independent Research. After 3 successful years as a president of WAS APC chapter, Dr. Drillet has recently been elected director for the board of World Aquaculture Society, where he is chairing the industry committee and the subcommittee on social medias. Now he is leading a working group within the World Aquaculture to learn about plastics in aquaculture. So today we will learn, he will be sharing his input on microplastic impact in aquaculture industry. Please, Dr. Drillet, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. And let me share my slides. I have tried that before, so it should be working.
Yeah.
This one. It should be working, correct?
Okay, I think that's work.
All right, and I will put it in full screen. And thank you very much for your introduction and good day to all. It's working, right? I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss a little bit about microplastic in aquaculture and aquaculture. For my job in SGS, you know, SGS, we are a very large testing inspection company, the largest, 100,000 employees and people all around the world. And I'm looking after the entire region, all the way from Korea to New Zealand, all the way to Pakistan. And microplastic necessary has been in my agenda for long. We have laboratory testing for microplastic for more than a decade in many environments. But in the context of aquaculture, it's particularly important. And so today, during my presentation here, I will, let's say, keep a relatively high level and talk about aquaculture and talk about really the influence that microplastic can have on aquaculture. And the reason for it is a few years ago, we were approached by FAO and GESAM to try to support, to gather information about plastic in aquaculture, because most of the report you find is always fisheries and aquaculture merged together. And so I took the decision to chair a session together with the World Aquaculture Society and the IMREST to run basically a roundtable that was run over about a year period. We had multiple meetings and where we review basically what we know, what we don't know, where we think we really have problem and we should do something, and so on and so on. So this is basically what I'm going to scan through here. And I'm going to put back that presentation really in the context of aquaculture, because most of the plastic particle that flush down the river end up in the sea, and this is where we grow a lot of our food. The reason why it's particularly important is aquaculture is the fastest food growing sector in the world. We need to increase food production globally to reach basically the amount of food we need to feed the humanity by 2050. We need to increase 70% since what we were producing in 2007. Not because I'm French, but this is not something new. But Commandant Cousteau in the 1970s was already saying we need to start farming the sea the way we farm the land. So while he's a very strong supporter of protecting coastal environment and the sea in general, biodiversity in general, I think he was pragmatic enough to realize we will need to go to farm on the sea the way we farm on land. And there are many reasons for it. Today, half of the fish or seafood product we eat actually come from aquaculture. 90% of it is produced in Asia, so we are really in a regional hotspot. What people tend to forget is when we're talking about marine aquaculture, the majority of marine aquaculture actually is not fish. We're talking about algae, we're talking about bivalves, so extractive aquaculture, so organisms that are actually not fed, but organisms that are feeding in the water column, either nutrients or filter feeders like all the bivalves. If we want to grow more food in the sea, we have plenty of space actually worldwide, and we can produce as much as we capture in less than 0.01% 0.1% of the global ocean area. So it's really an opportunity for communities living in coastal areas to actually use that coastal area to farm food that we need to feed people. And when I say it's an opportunity also because if we want to continue produce and increase the production of animal proteins on land, we need more arable land. And more arable land means we need to cut down tropical forests, which we just agreed not to do. There are ways to do it right. We need to support the development of sustainable aquaculture. And this is why I took the decision to run for the World Aquaculture Society Board of Directors. WAS is a scientific community. We have scientific conference every year, and we merge that together with the industry. So the industry meets the science, and we can basically support sustainable development much faster. Aquaculture is an area where you have huge investment. You know what's going on in Singapore these days. This is also coming big. And I think this is the right way to go. It doesn't mean that we can just go without thinking. We need to make sure that the development of this industry is actually sustainable. So now the question that is really important here is aquaculture at risk because of microplastic pollution? Managing risk requires that we understand, and I say risk for food safety, and I talk also about risk of food security. You will see later in my presentation. It requires that we understand exactly what is a hazard, what is the level of exposure, the severity of the impact, and so on. So we can measure risk and we can do something with it. We can mitigate it. We can decide to stop eating seafood if really there is a risk that we cannot mitigate, and so on and so on. If you look into the literature, you will see that there are many different definitions of microplastic and nanoplastic that are used. And that's because we are dealing with different issues, different challenges. So different risks have been identified somehow, different hazards have been identified, and we are trying to respond to this. A couple of minutes ago, there was a very nice presentation from a colleague from New Zealand who was presenting what was done in New Zealand. If you are looking at the impact of, for example, a particle on the digestion process, you may not necessarily have an uptake of chemical within your cells and so on. You are looking at larger particles. If you are looking at chemical impacts, you are looking maybe at particles passing through the intestinal epithelia, and those are about 100 nanometers. So different reports will really deal with different definition of microplastic. And so in reality, we need to make sure, in order to ensure comparabilities between the data we produce globally, that we define clearly what we are dealing with here. It's a semantic exercise driven by the objective. What are we going to try to assess, and are we going to do so? So far, there are two standard organizations who have developed definition for microplastic, and that ASTM and ISO. It doesn't mean that these will be necessarily the definition we will use in all industries and so on, but this is already somehow a start. When we talk about aquaculture product and we start wondering where these plastic are from, we have the plastic that are already in the sea, the microplastic that are basically floating around or resuspended from the sediment. And the accumulation here can be done by filtration somehow of this water by the bivalves and so on. We know, for example, we accumulate quite a bit of microplastic particles in mussels and oysters. But you may also have fish with a specific behavior that will have a tendency to eat more of this plastic particle. I mean, think about your kids. We all have kids who eat Lego particles, and I think the red one are pretty nice and pretty cool, right? So it's exactly the same here in the natural environment. And we do find organisms that contain more or less of this particle. Some of them are digested, some of them may not. If you think about aquaculture, not the extractive aquaculture, but the fish aquaculture, where we are feeding the organism, they are not basically prone to pick up plastic particle everywhere in the environment because we feed them. But there is a risk that we feed them with feed that contain microplastic. There is a fantastic paper from Thiele, just got published in Nature. Here, you need to know that in the feed that we feed the fish, there is only about 10% actually of fish that come from fish that we have been capturing in the sea. So the fish meal produced from the fish we capture in the sea represent only 10% of the final feed we feed to the fish. All the rest is plant proteins, blood meals, bone meals, and so on and so on and so on. So it's not a lot of fish meal we put today in the fish feed. We keep some primarily for the carnivorous fish. For the herbivores, we don't have too much issues. But we can transfer basically particle from the fish we capture to the feed millers, through the feed directly to the fish that we are going to eat. I will discuss a bit later about the farm and the amount of plastic and the risk from the plastic generated from the farm itself. But there is a risk in the product that we are feeding on. Is actually later in the food chain, and we are talking about the transport. We are talking about the transportation, the transformation of the product in the factories, and we are talking about the clothing at home, your clothing going into the food, the cooking utensils, and for example, the cooking process. We have very, very little knowledge about how plastic are going to behave whilst they are being cooked, and how this is going to impact the safety of the product we eat.
I just said, yeah, okay, yeah, thanks.
Kartik, I can hear you. There is plastic actually accumulating in the fish, whether they are farmed or captured, or the seafood product. There's a very nice report from the FAO on that particular topic that has been published a couple of years ago. And we have had yesterday 2 very nice presentations from colleagues from Bangladesh and from Singapore about the transfer of pathogens potentially on biofouling on small plastic particles that are spreading around, particle in the fish guts and so on. And the real question here is the risk associated with the presence of those particles in the seafood that we eat acceptable, or is it not acceptable? And this is really the question that we must answer today, because we can talk a lot about what we see, but if it's not an issue, then maybe we should not talk too much about it. In reality, we know that the accumulation of plastic particles in the digestive tract may generate, I would say, decrease or feeling of satiety, for example, from the fish. So they may feed less, so they may have a lower food conversion ratio, they may grow slower. But normally, most of the plastic particle that one organism will eat, will eventually go out, unless it's too big particles. Try yourself to eat a big Lego. You'll probably end up at the hospital for taking it out on the other side. From the toxicity study that have been carried out so far across a wide range of sizes of plastic particles, with all the limitation that each of these individual studies will have, we know that the level of toxicity may exist, has been proven in some cases, but is not necessarily reaching a level that should be considered of high concern so far. It doesn't mean that it could not be an issue once in a while, but so far, most of the studies show that the risk is not extremely important. There's been COVID. All the students have been sitting at home. There is a fantastic presentation or paper that just came out from the University of McGill in Quebec, and talks actually about how we do evaluate the toxicity from plastic on organism. And that's very interesting, actually, because most of the study that are actually weathering the plastic particle in order to reconstitute somehow or reevaluate the risk for the food, for the organism, and so on, they follow international protocol, STM, ISO. But those are relatively fast proposals trying to reconstitute basically what happened in the nature. There are only a few studies that have been published globally that are really using microplastic collected from the natural environment to evaluate the potential toxicity on organism. And you need to think about the plastic that we may find in the mussels or in the oysters out there may be an old piece of plastic that have been sitting in the water column for the last 25 or 30 years. And so the level of toxicity, the shape, the size, the density, the fact that it can break in small pieces may be very different from a relatively new particle that just got produced not long ago. So this is really a field that is important if we want to evaluate the level of risk from those microplastics and the toxicity. We need to understand where that plastic actually are going to impact the toxicity somehow, or how toxic are they going to be on the organism that we produce, but also on us eventually after cooking and so on. So what is really the main risk associated with microplastic today for the aquaculture industry, and I say and society? The main risk is probably over-communication about risk, while there is no very clear pattern that we have a high level of toxicity. We know there are cases where there are toxicity, but it's not true across all the plastic that we find everywhere in the organism we see. So I do think, and that this is a very personal opinion, but I do think that the biggest risk today is really social acceptance of that. There will be some piece of plastic in the fish you eat, like there is piece of plastic in all the food that we eat, all the drinks that we drink. And this is why I referred to the presentation from the scientists from New Zealand a couple of minutes ago. We need to be careful not to over-communicate about risk when they are not clearly defined. Today, we have a very, very large proportion of the world population, which is either undernourished, and we're talking about 1 billion people today in the last UN report after COVID impact, and other that are basically under malnutrition. They eat basically bad food. Fish is one of the best food we have access to. We should not stop eating fish just because maybe there could be a risk. We want to make sure that people have access to a quantity and quality of food that is necessary to have healthy people around. If you are interested, there is a fantastic project from actually Europe on the I would say the limitation of social acceptability of aquaculture in the European region. In Asia, we have less problem because we have been producing fish in aquaculture for the last many thousand years, and it's much more accepted in the population. So what can we do today? And what I will exhort scientists to do is to continue measure and continue research. Not necessarily always, I would say, high-level academic research, but it can be routine monitoring because we need to monitor the quantity of plastic in the environment. We need to continue evaluating potential toxicological impacts, physiological impact of microplastic in the seafood and in other food we eat. We need to make sure we evaluate risk based on real-life condition of the particles, so the weathering. I reported, I discussed about a bit earlier. And we need to benchmark this risk we are reporting in scientific papers against other existing risks. For example, food processing, cooking, and so on. If you take a piece of your beefsteak from the shop next door, you may have a contact material, plastic, that you are going to cook, and this may be actually much worse than any potential microplastic that exists in this piece of meat or veggie or anything like this. We need to ensure comparability. In that, we need to make sure that when we write scientific paper, we clearly define what are the size fraction we are looking at, what are the let's say the recovery rate of the plastic we have measured. There are many studies published a lot of numbers of particles, but don't necessarily publish or monitor the quantity of number of plastic. If you remember the presentation from Professor Jess from Denmark on the first day of the conference here, he was reporting that they find in the discharge from the wastewater treatment plant, one single wastewater treatment plant from Denmark, as much plastic as all China together, from all the wastewater treatment plant from China together. And that is due to how we are measuring, what we are measuring, and so on. So it's very important to very much clarify, and while we cannot necessarily standardize, because we don't necessarily want to standardize too early, we need to first define what we want to measure and why before we do standardization, but we need to ensure that there is a high level of comparability. And this is extraction and preparation protocol, which is very important. This is a QC. This is a use of transferable database. The picture you see here is from the simple software, the freeware Professor Jess was introducing to on Monday. This is in SGS, a solution that we have implemented for environmental testing. And we are testing every day, many samples using this approach because we believe this is the one that will be the most transferable and comparable across studies. for the use of FTIR technology. Yes? You can also use other technologies if you know what you are looking for. So I would say from the risk from aquaculture, there is potentially a risk that need to be evaluated, but there are also a lot of unknowns today on the fate of microplastic in the environment. We still don't know exactly what will be the potential impact on food safety from the fish that are fished, but also from the farm product. At this stage, I would say the level of risk associated with microplastic in seafood does not seem to decrease the overall benefits of eating seafood. So we should continue to eat seafood and make sure that we are healthy. But we need to keep an eye on basically consumer behavior, because there have been quite a bit of misleading information globally. And some of this communication sometimes are outrageous and put actually countries at risk, because we want to make sure people have access to decent food so they can actually have a good life. So comparability is necessary. Standardization will come eventually, but in order to standardize, we will need to define exactly what we want to measure and for what reason we want to measure in that particular size group with that particular method and so on. So that standardization come later, but I think the most important one is we ensure we can compare the result we are producing today. Now the question is aquaculture a source of microplastic? Because aquaculture is in the water, and we talk a lot about the total production of plastic, and we say, well, we produce 400 million today, we'll produce 1 billion ton by 2050. There are 20 million ton every year that are discharged in the environment because they are not recycled, and so in Singapore we incinerate. But and you see this number, 80% of unmanaged waste streams come from land sources. And that's true, but not everywhere. There's an excellent work that has been carried out for the last 10, 15 years by the Koreans. It's called Korean National Marine Debris Monitoring Program. And when they started doing this program, they realized that a lot of the marine litter they find on the coastline is actually from aquaculture. And we're talking about these polystyrene floaters and so on. They have not started screaming at aquaculture. They have said we need to support aquaculture in order to switch to more sustainable practices. And so they are using floaters that are long-term, long-lasting, so there's less degradation of the particles, less piece of polystyrene discharge. And today, basically, this is not anymore the majority of the plastic they find, marine litter they find on the coastline. So this is really coming. But regardless of whether the plastic we find in the environment is primarily from terrestrial sources or not, the industry in the marine sector must do something about their pollution themselves. So my journey with plastic started a couple of years ago when I was asked by Amares to chair a working table on a round table on plastic pollution from the shipping industry. And we run that together with national parks and the British High Commission in Singapore. That was really an eye-opener here, and you realize that the industries have a lot of information. And when you start talking seriously about, wow, do you have this information? They tell you, yes, we do. We know exactly where we have problems, but we need solutions. Last year, it's about a year ago, the Ocean Plastic Interest Group was started in IMAREST. It's the first anniversary a few days ago. We have more than 200 corresponding members who come and explain what they observe in their industry and so on. So we are working across a wide range of different industries. Most of the waste that have been identified in the marine environment are fishing gears, so what we call abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gears. But there are other sources of plastic, and when we talk about microplastic, we should probably keep an eye on the gray waters from ship, which are not fully regulated. They are partly regulated under IMO, but they are neither fully regulated under MARPOL Annex 5, neither fully regulated under MARPOL Annex 4, which is basically sewage and waste management. But if you look at an industry like the shipping industry, it's highly regulated when it comes to management of waste. MARPOL Annex 5 forbid any ship to discharge any plastic, and then they segregate on every single ship you see outside in the port of Singapore. Every ship is going to segregate all the different type of plastic. The big question here is not necessarily about the industry itself, it's reception facilities in different ports around the world to make sure that the recycling process is actually carried out properly. Interesting point that I thought was interesting to mention here. We talk a lot about the single-use plastic, and we should totally ban it. But there are industries where single-use plastic is basically a necessity for, I would say, safety reasons. If you are working on a submarine or so, you want to make sure that your crew is not basically contaminating each other with disease. And so you may want to use a single-use plastic to ensure higher or decrease risk basically for the transfer of disease across the crew, for example. In aquaculture, there are some development coming up in terms of accreditation with the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. There are a few countries like Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania is doing quite a bit of work as well, where you have, I would say, national requirement in developing plastic registers at the company level. And the idea here is relatively, I would say, simple in its concept, but it's really complex in implementation, in that we are looking about evaluating where the plastic in a farm, how much there is, and there is always more than what you think. This is what came out of the roundtable on plastic and aquaculture last year. We use plastic in cages, in tanks. We use nets, ropes. If you think about recirculated aquaculture system, all the biofilters, the moving beds, is all plastics. And so all this plastic here, you need to know, am I going to be able to recycle it or not? And the biggest issue we have in this industry is actually recycling, because a lot of the recycling facility do not want to take nets and so on that have been used in fish farm because they are dirty, there's been biofouling on it. And so finding ways to discard or recycle your plastic from a farming or fishing perspective can be really challenging. So really there is a big effort to do here on the recycling process, the waste management. Some of these plastic can be exchanged for more sustainable product. It can be wood, it can be bamboo in some cases, it can be beton or cement in others. And then you have those farms that are basically farming offshore, and after storm, for example, you need to have a checklist to make sure that you didn't lose any plastic, so you can actually record how much you have lost into the environment. And that's very important. And that goes with social experience in going cleaning the beaches. If you remember the presentation on the first day, I said, well, we do have a lot of beach cleaning process, but this is nothing new. I mean, people have been cleaning beaches all around the world for the last 30 years or so, since we have waste on it and we want to access a clean environment. It's just that we have more and more plastic, and we need to make sure that we have recycling process. We have a process to ensure we capture it before it's lost into the environment. So where should the focus be? And this is very much from an SGS perspective, sensibilization to the public, farmers, consumers. This is to be driven by government, incentive, financial certification, and so on. If you look at an industry, normally you have a bell curve. You have the top performer. They always have access to knowledge, they have access to finance, and they can lead basically new certification program and basically check all the marks here that have been developed primarily for that they are capable of doing it. But in Asia, we have 20 million fish farmers, and a lot of them actually are not rich fish farmers with access to knowledge, education, and so on. And this one, they need to be supported by the governments actually to catch up with I would say, the environmental protection needs they need to meet. For us in SGS, we offer, as I said, monitoring. We have a commercial process for microplastic and marine litter. We do on a daily basis. And we can support as well with waste management, research on toxicity, and so on. So this is a little bit of my presentation here. It's a bit, I would say, one step back compared to the purely technical process. I could have made a presentation on an FTR microscopy and analysis of microplastic in the environment, but I will have basically ended up doing the same presentation as Professor Jess from Monday. So I think it will be it was a better idea to look at the issue with plastic from an industry point of view, and I will be happy to answer your question if you have any. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Drillet, for a very interesting, I think, very interesting talk. by Dr. Drillet. And I think it's a very clear and concise regarding on the effect of microplastic in the aquaculture industry. And I have a few questions on from the audience, but let's see if you can answer one of the questions first. And okay, when it comes to aquaculture, what is a challenge we are facing? First is water used in aquaculture may have microplastics itself and get into the seafood's organs or the aquaculture discharge. Or the second one is the aquaculture discharge introduce microplastic into the marine aquatic system. What is the biggest challenge between these two?
It really depends about which part of aquaculture you are dealing with. So if you are an oyster farmer or a mussel farmer, you will be somehow potentially impacted by the level of plastic in the environment, but they may not come from you at all. If you are a farmer using a recirculated aquaculture system, most of your plastic should stay in your sludge, but unless you basically manage your waste basically properly, this plastic may go back to the natural environment. So I think it's a give and take here. The challenge for coastal monitoring is really that a large proportion of microplastic actually are discharged from catchment area. They may be deposited from the air, coming on the land, being flushed with the rain, and then the fish may be impacted by it. But again, as I present in my in the talk here, when we are talking about fish, we feed them with pellets, and actually we can control the level of plastic actually we are going to send into the fish, because we have some level of control here before we feed them to the fish. Well, we don't have that with fisheries. But overall, the whole point here is we are talking about food production to feed people. So it's really there is a risk we need to evaluate and manage where it can be managed. But we have to be careful not to, I would say, scare the consumers from accessing food which is of high nutritional value, because we need to make sure people are healthy, and seafood is one of the best we have.
Okay. And then one more interesting question here. Okay, it was said that time is a big factor. Don't you think that it will be too hasty to consider a particular concentration of microplastic in fish as being low because it didn't induce toxic effect similar to metals or other pollution effects?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, it's interesting because government generate regulation based on the risks that have been assessed. So you make a risk assessment, and if you say there is a potential risk here for human consumption, I need to manage it. Therefore, I am going to say the level of pesticide, insecticide, antibiotics in the particular product I'm going to allow to be sold in my countries should not go above this level. Japan just make a new rule now about some chemicals residual in the fish, which are actually natural chemical, is clove oil. So in aquaculture, we use a lot of clove oil actually for anesthetics of the fish. I work a lot with fish and chips, but if you drop a drop of clove oil in the fish tank, all the fish go anesthetics floating on the tank is incredible. But some of these oils actually are potentially toxic for humans, and so Japan just increased the regulation or decreased the level of allowable concentration of the fish that can be imported to Japan. So it's all based on risk assessment.
Okay, thank you. I think there are a few more other questions, but because we kind of like want to be on the schedule, so I hope you can address all the questions, the one that in the question and answer panel. Okay, is it okay, Dr. Drillet?
No worries. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.